Welcome to our viewers. We are very glad that you could join us today. This lecture is being sponsored by the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. We are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, and we are very pleased to be able to have this very important program today. And I think it's a timely moment in our history to examine what our speaker today is going to talk about. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. Today's program is co-sponsored with the Critical Race Initiative program in the Department of Sociology, also at the University of Maryland. I would, of course, like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, the Assistant Director of the Baha'i Chair, for her constant support in organizing these events. Thank you very much, Dr. Seaman. I would also like to, of course, extend a very warm welcome to our honored speaker, Dr. Nyseth Brehm, whom I will introduce to you in a minute. But I would like to go over a few technical matters at this time. So you are muted and your video is turned off when you join this virtual meeting. Please note that we are recording today's program, and by participating in today's program, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, and/or voice possibly being recorded. You will have the opportunity to submit questions at the end of the lecture by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But this will occur at the end of the lecture, so we ask you to be patient until that time. So the Baha'i Chair for World Peace is a place where we are constantly working step by step to understand human nature and to address the root causes of sexism, racial prejudice, conflict, inequality, and social, economic, political, and religious mistreatment of all kinds. Our aim is to provide a platform and an archive of human understanding and to shine a light on those issues and those individuals engaged in good work. And this brings me to the work, the good work that our speaker is doing, Dr. Nyseth Brehm, whose lecture today is called Reentry and Reintegration of People Convicted of Genocide in Rwanda. Much has been made in our day of the talk for justice in our societies, and this can truly be a noble effort. But any thoughtful account of human nature and human possibility could also seem to necessitate space for mercy, for grace, and for reconciliation, even under the most horrific of circumstances. Today's talk seeks to provide us with a roadmap for how this might be done and to what we as a society owe to each other. That is to say, what we owe not only to the innocent among us, but to the guilty as well. Using the Rwanda genocide as her topic, Dr. Hollie Nyseth Brehm takes us on a journey through a dark chapter in human history, and in the process seeks to uncover those lessons that might help us to secure a brighter future. Dr. Nyseth Brehm is Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminology at The Ohio State University. She has published more than 30 articles and book chapters on genocide and violence, and is the recipient of the International Association of Genocide Scholars Emerging Scholar Prize, as well as the American Society of Criminology's Cavan Young Scholar Award, which are the highest honors given to early career scholars in each association. Dr. Nyseth Brehm is the principal investigator of 2 grants from the U.S. National Science Foundation that each focus on how countries recover from violence. She serves on a U.S. Atrocity Prevention Task Force and has worked with RWANDA'S National Commission for the fight against genocide since 2012. Dr. Nyseth Brehm is also on the boards of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, Refuge, and I Activism, and she serves as a consultant for numerous other organizations and leads a research cluster on transitions after violence at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. At Ohio State, Dr. Nyseth Brehm teaches classes on genocide, terrorism, and violence. She has won both the college's and the university's highest teaching honors, and she brings Ohio State University students to Rwanda each summer to learn about genocide. The title of her talk, as I mentioned, is Reentry and Reintegration of People Convicted of Genocide and Rwanda in Rwanda. Please welcome to Dr. Nyseth Brehm to this wonderful program. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Give me one moment just to get my PowerPoint up. All right, thank you all so much for tuning in today. As I know many, if not all of you are well aware, in 1994, Rwanda witnessed a brutal genocide. In about 3 months, upwards of 1 million people were killed, 250,000 people were raped, and millions of people were displaced, both inside of Rwanda and outside of Rwanda. This violence was largely planned by people within the government, but it was mostly executed by people on the ground, essentially civilians. So during the course of those 3 months, ordinary Rwandans picked up clubs and machetes and went door to door, often seeking to kill the very people they had previously worshipped with, the kids who had played with their kids, people they had gone to school together. In the aftermath of the violence, the government of Rwanda created a localized court system that put many of these people in prison. So actually hundreds of thousands of people were sent to prison in the aftermath of the genocide. Since then, these people have been returning home. And in most cases, they're actually returning to live side by side next to the people who they harmed in 1994. This wide-scale reentry and reintegration effort is nothing short of astounding. So you see here on this slide, the incarceration rate in the US and Rwanda. And I have the US because we are known for having one of the highest incarceration rates in the entire world. And you see that we are that line in blue on the bottom. The data for Rwanda, which unfortunately aren't available before 1994, but would have been well below that blue line, show a soaring incarceration rate after the genocide. And this is really those hundreds of thousands who were sent to prison and then have gradually been coming back home. I've been fascinated by this wide-scale reentry and reintegration, and I think we have a lot we can learn from this in terms of peace and stability in Rwanda, but also worldwide. So I've been working on a project for a couple of years that seeks to address a couple of bigger questions. First, I'm really curious to learn about the obstacles these people face as they come back home, and again, often live side by side with the people that they harmed 20 to 25 years ago. Second, I'm interested in what actually facilitates success, what actually helps sow peace on the ground at the individual, family, community, and state levels. This is a broader project, and today I'll be focusing on a small piece of it, and specifically on initial reentry, so the initial weeks and months that someone is home from prison, and how this can actually set the stage for broader reintegration, and specifically social reintegration, so someone's relationships with their family and with their community. So for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about theory, basically just different ideas that motivate this study, prior work that's important to this research. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the case of Rwanda. Of course, if I'm going to do this in a couple of minutes, it'll be a gross oversimplification of the history. So if folks have questions during the Q&A, I'm really happy to talk more about the history of the genocide and of the court system. After I tell you a brief version of that, I'll talk a little bit about this research project, which has basically involved me following 200 people, starting with interviewing them before they left prison and then interviewing them 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years after they returned home. as well as talking with 100 community members about how they view this wide-scale reentry and reintegration. At that point, I'll tell you 3 key insights, again, tied specifically to initial reentry, tied to social reintegration, and then I'll try to broaden back out to broader implications. And I'll try to do all of this in 40 minutes. I have a tendency to speak quickly, so if I am going too quickly, please feel free to share in the chat or to just let me know to slow down a little bit. So to start, surprisingly, there are actually no studies or no systematic studies of what happens when people who commit genocide go to prison and return home. And this is actually very surprising because even though you might think genocide is rare, it's actually occurred in 45 countries since the Holocaust. And more than 150 countries have outlawed genocide, meaning that in many societies, from Bosnia to Cambodia, to Sudan, to Rwanda, people have committed genocide and have essentially, at some point in time, returned to their communities. Because there are no studies on this in genocide studies literature, I draw more broadly on literature from criminology and political science. And there is a lot of excellent work on this, so there's far too much to cover. But just so you have an idea, a lot of excellent criminologists have looked at the many factors that impact reentry and reintegration. And what we know is that it's really a dynamic, multifaceted process that is impacted by a whole host of factors. So we know that pre-PRISM circumstances impact it. We know that in-PRISM circumstances, so for instance, if someone was visited, if their family came, things like that. We know that immediate post-prison experiences impact reentry and reintegration, like if someone is able to find housing right away. And also post-release reintegration experiences matter, like if they're able to find a steady employment in the months afterwards. We also know that these processes vary based on a whole host of other factors. So individual factors matter. For instance, we know this process is often easier for someone who's older and harder for men. Family factors matter as well. So we know that folks who come from tight-knit families often have easier experiences coming back from prison or coming back from joining a militia, for instance. We also know that the community setting matters as well. So people who go essentially to worse off communities typically have harder experiences. And finally, we know that state factors matter as well. So oftentimes countries pass laws that can either help or hinder reintegration in a variety of different ways. So there is a lot of research out there on this, far too much for us to summarize now, but I did want to quickly point out for you one theory that is really important for the results I'll be sharing with you in a bit. And this is a theory known as labeling theory. I know a few of you listening are criminologists, so you would be well acquainted with this theory. But for those of you who haven't heard of this, it essentially just holds that labels matter. So how we label ourselves or how others label us is particularly important. So in this case, once individuals are labeled as deviant, or in this case as a genocidaire, or you could think as a terrorist, this label can continue to impact their life in a variety of ways. There have been a lot of interesting studies that have shown this. So in the US context, for instance, there are studies in Florida looking at people who, all else equal, are either assigned as a felony or not. So they might have the same age, gender, history with crime, but some people are actually given a felony and others are not. And we see that those that are essentially labeled as felons within 2 years are 4 times more likely to recidivate or to end up back in prison. And this broadly means that these labels, whether someone's called a felon, a genocidaire, a terrorist, can have a lot of consequences. In literature on extremist violence, we also know that if someone is labeled and stigmatized, often they have little chances to gain affirmation or respect in mainstream society, and then can often turn back towards deviant crowds, often back to the very violence that brought them to prison in the first place. So this suggests it's particularly important to pay attention to labels. It also suggests it's important to pay attention to community responses to the people who are coming back. There is a fantastic book, it's a little bit dated now, by John Braithwaite, that really looks at something known as reintegrative shaming and how people can actually be welcomed back with gestures of reacceptance rather than stigmatized when they come back home from prison or from a militia or from engaging in terrorism. And there's a lot of good literature and research today that supports that. So there was a study of former combatants in Liberia a number of years ago, and they were surveyed to see what would make them essentially return to violence. And among the top two things, they said rejection by their families and their communities would actually lead them back to violence. So all of this is to say that acceptance by the community matters, and tied to this, labels matter. So how we talk about violence, how we talk about the people engaged in violence is actually really consequential for what happens next. So as I mentioned, I'm focusing on the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And again, to really oversimplify this is tricky, but I will try. This violence started in many years ago with colonialism. And Rwanda was colonized first by Germany and then by Belgium. And Belgium in particular essentially racialized existing identities. And what I mean by that is at the time, there were three main ethnic groups in Rwanda: Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. And these ethnic groups were actually social classes. Tutsi were the individuals who are well off, Hutu and Twa were less well off. And when Belgium took over in their colonial enterprise, they decided to create a census and to racialize identities, so to actually attach phenotypical characteristics to what it meant to be a Hutu or a Tutsi. And they essentially said that Tutsi were taller and had lighter skin and were more like Europeans, so very racist thinking, essentially thinking that they were better because they were typically the individuals who were better off because they had more cows, and that Hutu were shorter, had darker skin, had bigger noses, essentially were more African. And because they saw Tutsi as having lighter skin and as closer to Europeans, they gave them most, if not all, of the positions of power within the colonial administration. Tutsi at this point in time were only about 10% of the population, but they held the vast majority of power. And this created a system of oppression for Hutu, who for many years were subjugated, and then essentially rose up in the 1950s, took power, and essentially flipped power in the country. So you see a timeline here. I don't have time to go over all of it, but I at least wanted you to understand that this genocide did not just happen overnight, and there were really decades of preconditions going all the way back to colonialism that really essentially set the stage for this violence, and often a lot of strife over power. A lot of this culminated in a civil war between Hutu and Tutsi in 1990, and finally in the genocide. And at the outset, I mentioned this started in 1994, specifically April 6, 1994. The president was assassinated, and just hours after the assassination, this genocide began. As I mentioned, this violence was widespread. It affected almost the entire country, which itself is about the size of Maryland. Millions were displaced, about 1 million were killed, and there was much violence throughout the country. As I also mentioned, this violence was largely perpetrated by civilians, people who typically had not engaged in violence in the past. So after the genocide, the new government was stuck with how to actually hold these individuals accountable. What should they do with the fact that hundreds of thousands of people committed violence? And their response was to create something known as the GACACA courts. So my prior study was actually really focused on studying these courts and understanding how they worked, which is what got me interested in reentry and reintegration in the first place. Broadly, what they decided to do is that every community within Rwanda, every local community had their own court. And they elected their own judges who did not have to have legal training. Rather, they just had to be good, upstanding members of the community. And they had trials every week for about 10 years, where the community came together to talk about what happened. There was a lot wrong with these courts, so I'm happy to talk more about the promises and pitfalls of a model like this, what they did well and what could have been better. But it's important to note that folks did stand in front of their community. They were essentially shamed for what they did. They often had to own up for what they did. There was a conversation about the violence, and then they were often given some type of sentence. These courts had 3 levels of genocidal crime. So before the genocide, the crime of genocide was not in Rwanda's criminal code. So they also had to decide, how would they hold people accountable? What would that look like? And they created 3 categories of genocidal crime. They had category 3, which was property violence, category 2, which was essentially genocidal murder, and category 1, which is broadly those who planned the violence, who orchestrated it, or who were involved at some higher level. And as you see on the slide, the vast majority of cases, of the almost 2 million cases that were tried, were crimes against property. These individuals, if they only engaged in crimes against property, they were not sent to prison. So the prison sentences were specifically for the individuals in categories 1 and 2. And specifically, about 230,000 people were found guilty of genocidal violence. So these would be the individuals who participated in killing groups. Often they killed individuals themselves, or they egged people on and assisted with murder, or again, perhaps they were at a higher level and they planned the violence in some way. For instance, a mayor within a community who really oversaw violence and encouraged others to participate. They were then sent to prison or an alternative, which was known as TEAJ, which was essentially a community service camp that moved around the country and engaged in community service acts like rebuilding roads and schools, or sometimes even building homes for survivors. And among these trials, as you see, a lot of people were found not guilty, but those who were found to be guilty were sent to prison or TEAJ, and again have now been coming back to their communities, again moving typically back to the very community where they committed violence in the first place. So, as I mentioned, I was in Rwanda studying the court system because I found it particularly fascinating, and I'm happy to talk more about how it worked during our question and answer period. And I noticed that these individuals were coming back to their communities and no one was studying this phenomenon. So I approached Rwanda Correctional Services and I asked if they would be interested if I were to study what was going on and if it would be useful for them. And they replied, of course, they would be happy to create programs that could aid reentry and reintegration and make this a better experience for everyone based on the findings. So I applied for a grant from the US National Science Foundation to study what was happening as people left prison and went back home. This started in 2016, this entire process. And in 2017, I interviewed 200 people who left prisons sometime in 2018. This essentially involved going in every prison and every community camp in the country and asking if people who are going to be leaving prison would be willing to participate in this research study. I spoke with 181 men and 19 women. I should note on the prior slide, you saw both men and women participated in the violence, although it was more men than women. About 5% of the crimes against people were committed by women. I oversampled, and about 10% of my sample are women because I'm interested in how these experiences are gendered. So how men and women experience reentry and reintegration differently is something you're going to see in a little bit. The people that I spoke with had crimes of genocide that ranged from killing 1 or 2 people to killing 10 to 15 people. And accordingly, they had different sentences that ranged from 8 years to 25 years. And in the broader study, I'm varying a number of things I'm not talking about today. So I'm looking at if they go back to an urban or a rural area, if they left straight from prison or from community service. So trying to see how these things impact their reentry and reintegration. But we won't get into that much today. It's also important to note that I have a comparison group that we're also not talking too much about today, but I've also been following 20 people who left prison for lack of a better term, ordinary crimes. So those who did not commit genocide, but perhaps were in prison for homicide or a drug-related offense, not tied to the genocide, but were going back to their communities at the same time. So I could understand what is unique to reentry and reintegration following genocide. So I spoke with these individuals before they left prison, and this was especially important because I wanted to understand both what was happening when they were in prison, as well as what they thought life was going to be like in their communities, what they were nervous about, what they were planning, things like that. I then found them all in their communities about 6 months afterwards. And most of these people did not have phones, so it involved usually asking them where they planned to go, getting their consent to try to show up in that approximate area and find them in Rwanda, and then walking around the neighborhood to try to figure out where they had ended up. So we found them at their home 6 months later, and at that point in time, we also interviewed their spouses to hear how this process was impacting the families. Then again, 1 year after their release, we found them again at their homes. And I should note, if they weren't comfortable with me coming to their home, especially as someone who might draw attention in rural Rwanda, they had the option to travel with me paying for their travel to come to meet me at a nonprofit in Kigali, the capital city, and to conduct the interview there. Finally, for a subset, I also talked with them 2 years after their release. As I mentioned, this is a dynamic process, and I really wanted to understand it over time. Although today we're largely talking about this 6-month T2 block that you see on the screen. These conversations are in-depth translated interviews. I do speak some Kinyarwanda. My partner is Rwandan, so I've been learning a lot more. But nonetheless, I do not speak enough to conduct these interviews myself. So I work with an amazing team of Rwandans who have been tremendously integral to this project and who will be publishing a lot of this project with me. We spoke with individuals about their family, their friends, their health, how they think about their crimes, their hopes, their fears, essentially everything you can think of. And most of the conversations lasted about 4 hours initially, and most of the follow-up interviews were between 3 and 4 hours as well. And you can probably imagine by the 4th time, having visited someone 4 times, we had developed a lot of rapport and often remembered one another and had great conversations, sort of hearkening back to our conversations 2 years prior. So we got to know these individuals fairly well over the course of the last few years. We also spoke with community members. So again, this is a process that involves communities. They're going back into something, their prior communities. So we interviewed 100 community members about what they think was happening as people were going back home. And we purposefully talked with people, some in focus groups, which are basically group interviews, other in one-on-one interviews. And we spoke with them about if they were afraid people were coming back, if they were engaging with the people who were coming back, if they chose to visit them, why, things like that. And we purposely spoke with people from different groups. So we talked with genocide survivors, we talked with people who would have been targeted during the genocide, but were not in the country during it. So essentially those who had the foresight to flee before the genocide started and came back. We also talked with individuals who were Hutu but did not participate in the genocide, as well as today's college students. So people who are youth who essentially were not alive during the genocide, but are certainly deeply impacted by it nonetheless. And we did these interviews in different communities. So we didn't just focus on the individuals in this study who committed genocide, but rather wanted to speak more broadly in a number of different communities and see what they think about this process, as now communities across the country are seeing people come home from prison and move back to the community. So in the remainder of my time, I will tell you about 3 primary insights so far. And as I mentioned, I'm focusing today on initial reentry. So really on this 6-month mark that you see here, and sometimes even the first week someone was home. And I'm going to focus broadly on social reintegration. So again, how people are getting along with their families and their communities, which is one of many aspects of reintegration. And I'm going to start by talking first about gestures of reacceptance and person-first narratives, which I will explain. Then I'm going to shift to talking about how the community talks about violence and talk about structural narratives of violence and where the community places their blame. And then I'll finally conclude by talking a little bit about how what I've told you varies based on a couple of factors. I realize that might sound confusing, but hang tight and it will make sense in a moment. So to start then, if terms like reentry and reintegration are going to be meaningful, they usually involve more just than someone physically relocating to a community. They should involve some type of symbolic acceptance within that community. In Rwanda, I found that this is occurring through something known as a rite of passage. And to give you a little bit of background, we know that a lot of people who engage in violence or who go to prison essentially lose their identity, or they change their identity. So they had a certain identity. It often gets stripped away. They are engaged in violence, or they're an inmate. They have a new identity. And then they go back to their community, and they essentially need another identity at that point in time. This shift back to their community, this shift away from violence, this shift away from prison, is marked in Rwanda by a rite of passage. And a rite of passage is a universal phenomenon. They're essentially ceremonies or rituals that signify a shift or some change in someone's status. So you could think, for example, of a bachelorette party or a graduation party or a baby shower, something that essentially signals a large change in someone's identity and in their life. The examples I just mentioned are often large parties, but they need not be anything extreme like a party. It can often be a small ritual, something small but yet important that marks this shift. So in Rwanda, this is often marked by a welcome gift from a neighbor, by a family dinner, by some aspect that essentially is welcoming people home. So just to give you an example, someone, when I asked them what happened when they came home from prison, they said it was joy. It was a celebratory moment, and people were happy and were very supportive. They brought maize flour for making porridge, so they were really supportive, and this was a sign that they were happy to see us back. Another person told me, there are people that I never expected to help or to greet me, and they did it. Neighbors would come with Fanta. Some friends would come and give me small amounts of money. I'm going to be honest, when people first started telling me these stories, I initially thought they might be lying. I did not expect people to tell me that they were welcomed with open arms when they went back to their communities. As I told you a few times now, this genocide was widespread and it was very intimate. So people often killed people they knew with very intimate objects like clubs or machetes. So I thought that folks, when they went back to their communities, would face a lot of issues. But instead, time and time again, I was confronted with these narratives of people being welcomed. Just to give you one other example, Fidel told me about how he came home from prison. He didn't know how to get home because he had been away for almost 25 years. So his wife and children had to come into the bus stop to help him find their house. And along the way, they were introducing him to people or reintroducing him to people. And then he said, the following day, some of these neighbors came to my house. They came and we shared. Each of them contributed money for one bottle of alcohol. A few days later, Fidel told me that he even visited the sibling of a person that he killed. And he said he was really nervous, but they went to a bar, which is fairly common in Rwanda, and they talked. And in his words, he said, we shared a glass. For Fidel, these small acts, so people coming to contribute money for a bottle of alcohol, sharing a drink, was a really important gesture of reacceptance. And it doesn't necessarily mean that all is forgiven. Instead, it means that they are open to the possibility of engaging with them again, that they recognize that they are back, and that they recognize that they may be a changed individual. And again, they're open to reaccepting them within the community. So again, they don't have to be large, but they're highly meaningful for the individuals in this study. This is also really important because how these individuals see themselves is really impacted by how the community is seeing them. So a lot of people said something pretty similar to this first quote that you see. This is an amazing situation beyond any comparison to be back. Also, it kind of corrected my feeling people hated me. Most people in prison that I spoke with were very nervous about going back to their community. They, like I, thought they were going to be rejected. They didn't know where they would live. They didn't know if their families would still want them. And they had a lot of nerves about this process, understanding that they had committed genocide. So they too were surprised and very pleased, clearly, with this warm welcome in many instances. And many then impacted their own identities as they talked about it. So a lot of people then tied these to their narratives of redemption as they talked with me about what this meant for them when they came home. A lot of people said, for instance, I became a citizen again. I am a new person now. And importantly, many people said, I am no longer a genocidaire. So genocidaire is the term for someone who engages in genocide. And for almost everyone in the study, they were very clear that they did not want people using those terms anymore. They really wanted to be known as people first, not just as genocidaires. And they said if it had to be used, they were a person who committed genocide, but they didn't want to be known as a genocidaire. And this really interestingly mirrors a lot of research on person-first language. This is not yet encouraged by Rwandan policy. So in Rwanda, they actually do use the term term genocidaires, and one of my recommendations will be to move away from that. But even in the US, our Department of Justice in 2017 started moving away from language like felon to try to actually put the person first and to not actually signify or label a person by their acts of violence, but to remember that they are a person and they are not only defined by their act of violence. This breakage of the link between the person and the act, I think, is really important for seeing someone as a person who is redeemable, who can possibly come back to society, not someone who was only defined by a negative act that they did. Many of the people that I spoke with were also very eager to engage in activities that essentially allowed them to live up to this new identity. So many were very eager to engage in community service. There's something in Rwanda called Umuganda, where everyone comes together on the last Saturday of the month and does community service. Almost everyone was very eager to engage in that and to attend community meetings and to try to show others that they were new people, that they were trying to be engaged. And this really shows the importance of having these opportunities of being engaged once someone is back, whether it's voting, engaging in community service, whatever it is, something that helps them feel like an engaged citizen once again. So if you're like me, you might be wondering, why is this happening? Why are people being welcomed? I think there are a number of reasons for it, so I don't have all the answers to share with you today, but I have one at least, and one major reason that I think is facilitating this. As I also mentioned, interviewed community members. And as I spoke with community members, I asked them, why do you think people committed genocide? What made them do this? And across the board, whether someone was from a very rural area and had very little education, whether they were very educated, people told me a very structural narrative of the violence. So they would say, yes, they committed genocide, but to understand their actions, we have to understand colonialism. Some of the things that I told you about 20 minutes ago, they would essentially retell me this narrative, and they would say, you know, the genocide started in part because of colonialism, then it was the government that privileged certain people over others, then there were local leaders who encouraged the violence. So as they discuss the violence, they really see people's actions as structured by all of these different structural factors. And this is important. It doesn't take away their blame. It doesn't say these individuals are blameless, but rather it contextualizes their actions in a lot of complexities that are true to people's lived realities. And I don't mean to say that this narrative is without problems, but this is a very interesting situation going on in Rwanda. And one of the reasons it's going on is because the state has really adopted this structural narrative. So there are memorials throughout the country that teach people that the genocide happened for these very structural reasons. The school curricula, if you look at that, it also talks about the structural factors that encourage people to participate in violence. There are commemoration events every year, and then they also harken back to these very structural factors. So this is a very strong collective memory of the violence in society that focuses on the many complex factors for why the genocide happened. As I have a note on the bottom, state narratives have issues. So I'm not saying that a state narrative is perfect. This narrative has issues. All state narratives support the state and exclude certain people's suffering. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But in this case, it's really important because what I think it's doing is that it's having individuals in Rwanda understand that people are responsible for their actions. So again, they're not blameless, but they were impacted by a lot of different factors. And if we're really going to understand something like genocide, you know, something like racism, you really have to understand these very structural factors at play as well, not just these individual factors that encourage individuals to leave their homes and to kill others. This is important broadly for how people are being welcomed. So as I mentioned when I was going over that literature, I mentioned a study by Braithwaite where he talks about reintegrative shaming. And he says there's really two types. When people come back to their society, they can be stigmatized, which would essentially ostracize them, or they could be reintegrated. And this essentially reinforces their membership in a community of law-abiding people. He speaks a lot about how this should be directed at the evil act rather than the evil person. And here what I'm trying to tell you is that it also should involve some type of structural narrative of the violence. So some way to understand what happened that again contextualize people's actions. So essentially, I think that where the community members place blame, that they do blame these individuals, but they also understand that the genocide was impacted by colonialism, by a government that essentially discriminated against certain people and then other people, even by local leaders who encouraged the violence, that this is particularly important for understanding the genocide and for understanding why people are coming home and for accepting them for what they did. Thus far, I have talked about these factors as if they are monolithic and as if everyone coming back from prison or community service has had the same experience. They have not, and there are many other things I could tell you, but I'd like to finish by briefly telling you about two different factors that are also shaping these experiences. One is socioeconomic status. So in criminology, often if someone is better off, they have a better reentry and reintegration experience. So in a lot of literature, essentially if people are rich or better off, they often have an easier experience going back home. In Rwanda, this is actually in many ways the opposite. So many of the folks that I've spoke with who were in some positions of power are not doing as well as the people who were not in positions of power. And if you think about what I just told you, this makes some sense. So if there's a dominant narrative that people's actions are structured by all these structural factors, that local leaders encourage them to participate, for instance, the people who are local leaders cannot necessarily benefit from this narrative in quite the same way. So interestingly, often those who are higher socioeconomic status, who were in positions of power during the genocide, are not being accepted in quite the same way as most of the individuals who were typically just farmers, who often will say that they were farmers following orders, and will talk about these structural factors as well. Those of the highest socioeconomic status are doing fine. So there are a few people in my study who are very well off, who seem to be sheltered either way. But often those who have high SES, but not the highest, are not doing particularly well. And I should note that this is also extending to their family as well. So as people are coming back home, this impacts their wives or their husbands, but typically their wives, as well as their children in this process. Another factor that is impacting this process is gender. I've told you the story of how people are being welcomed home and how I think this is broadly impacted by structural narratives of the violence. The men are broadly being welcomed home. The women are struggling in my study. So you'll recall there are 19 women that I followed and 181 men broadly. And then amongst those who committed genocide, it's 180. But I've kept it just to women in particular. 3 of the 19 women have partners, whereas 70% of the men have partners. So women are not coming back to families in quite the same way. Most of the women's families rejected them, and most of their communities are rejecting them. So the women in this study have a categorically different experience than the men. They're often doing worse economically, which is something I haven't talked about as much. But nonetheless, the broader point here is that even though I'm telling a relatively happy story of people coming back and being welcomed, it's really important to note that this story is impacted by social location. And in particular, women are facing a very different experience. I think this is taking place for a couple of reasons, but broadly, when I asked community members about the women who committed genocide, many of them would say, you know, I can understand why a man would commit genocide, I understand, but the women who committed genocide, something had to be wrong with them. In other words, gendered ideas about who could or should have committed the genocide essentially excuse the men for what they did, but suggests that it was too far against a woman's nature to participate in violence. There's a lot of really interesting research on women who engage in extreme violence, and this isn't unique to Rwanda. So I have a couple of citations in the bottom. And broadly, we've seen that when women engage in extreme violence, often they're ostracized because they transgress gendered ideas about women and what they should do, and in this case, peaceful women. So in this study, rather unfortunately, the women are having a very different experience. And one of the recommendations that I've been discussing with Rwanda Correctional Services is whether there could be halfway houses or programs specifically for women to help them with the transition, since their transition is going far less smoothly. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but also want to save plenty of time for questions. So, to summarize, and if you're trying to think what are some things I could take away, I've told you a story of how there was a wide-scale genocide in Rwanda and how hundreds of thousands of people were sent to prison and then have been coming back to their communities. And I've told you about how I've been studying this process, and today focused specifically on initial reentry, so on what was happening just as they came back and re-entered their families and communities. I told you about how broadly, people are being welcomed, and this welcome is being facilitated by these small rituals or gestures of reacceptance, often family visiting, often friends visiting, bringing some type of flower or a drink, some small gesture that really signals that someone is welcome back in the community and that people are open to reaccepting them. I've told you about how this is impacting people's identities of themselves and how people are seeing others accept them and they want to live up to this, and how they're also talking about how they're changed, and importantly saying that they don't want to be known as genocidaires, but really want to move away from this language. I have tied this to a structural narrative and told you that I think one of the things facilitating this is that throughout the country of Rwanda, there's an emphasis on understanding the genocide holistically and on understanding that these individuals had their personal motives for actions, but there were all these other structural factors, starting with colonialism to the government, that also impacted the genocide and why it occurred in the first place. And then I finished by talking a little bit about how, even though this process is going relatively well, it's not going as well for people of higher socioeconomic status, or as you can tell, the group that I'm particularly invested in, women who are going back to their communities and who are being ostracized and are having a very different experience. So if you wanted to extrapolate this and think, how can these lessons, be useful in other situations? I have a couple of key takeaway lessons before we move to talking, and hopefully I get to engage with you all on your questions. The first, again, would be the importance of person-first language. So again, as I mentioned, many of the folks in this study really rejected the label of genocidaire. And it was really interesting because they were rejecting this, and at the same time, there's a whole host of research on how person-first language is really important. So as we talk about them, they are people who committed violence. They are not only defined by their actions. And this stands no matter what. In February, I was giving a talk in Mauritania with the Department of Defense of all organizations. And they had invited me to talk because they were working on formal ISIL fighters coming back to their communities. And they kept referring to them as the enemy or as terrorists. So we had a large conversation about how, if they're continually going to refer to them as the enemy or as terrorists, but they want them to re-enter their communities, this is setting up a pretty tricky situation because they're only going to be known by this one label. So thinking about breaking this link between the violent act and the person who engaged in violence is particularly important. Again, thinking about some type of gesture of reacceptance and rites of passage. So these really double as for the individual as a rite of passage to mark their transition into society, and for more broadly for the community to signal some type of reacceptance or at least open to engagement with these individuals. And in Rwanda, again, this was taking place by small gifts like flour or Fanta soda, or again, a drink, but it could be culturally specific in any country in the world. Nonetheless, the main point is there could be particularly markers that mark someone's transition back home and really signify their new identity and signify a shift away from their old identity. Another lesson then would be the importance of structural narratives that can contextualize and humanize actions. And I want to reiterate, this does not take away their blame. My partner is a survivor of the genocide. I in no way mean to suggest that these individuals are blameless, that they didn't do anything wrong. Of course, they committed genocide. But we have to understand their actions holistically and understand that a lot of different structures impacted their actions as well. And then finally, that reintegration experiences are going to vary by social location, and that they're not monolithic, that the people coming back are going to be impacted by a lot of different factors. And for this in particular, that programs cannot assume uniform experiences. And I mentioned that because, as I mentioned, in Rwanda, we're working on now creating some programs tied to this to aid reentry and reintegration and hopefully have even better experiences for people more broadly. I think I'm about out of time and I really want to save time for Q&A. So I'm just going to put this up here and we can talk about it. I wanted to close by saying a little bit about some of the particularities of Rwanda that might be encouraging this. So you can read that. And if you want to talk about it, we can ask about it. The last thing I'll note is that I've been working with a number of different organizations, specifically in Northern Ireland and Colombia now, where reentry and reintegration is happening in different contexts. So Colombia had a longstanding civil war and members of the FARC are coming back home. In Northern Ireland, it's members of the former IRA as well as youth gangs. And we, with the Department of Justice of Northern Ireland and a few other colleagues, are creating a global working group on reentry and reintegration across different contexts, whether it's someone coming back from prison in the US, someone coming back from ISIL in the Sahel region of Africa, wherever it is, to try to think about how we can share these lessons and really learn from each other. So if any of you are particularly interested in this topic, feel free to reach out and I'd love to have you involved in the working group. So with that, this is my email if someone wants to reach out. Otherwise, I look forward to addressing your questions and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation and so much for us to think about and ask questions. So please, audience, this is the time to go to the Q&A and ask your questions. And I'll start with the first one. How do Rwandans understand the UN's failure to intervene when advised the genocide was imminent?
That is an excellent question. So for those who don't know the background of this, the genocide, folks knew it was coming, as this question is signifying. So there was a commander with the UN who had warned the United Nations that Rwanda was stockpiling weapons, that there were groups of individuals who were creating lists of people to be hunted. So there were a lot of signs that the genocide was happening. It was mentioned at the beginning, I serve on a government atrocity prevention task force, and we know that we often know when genocide is going to happen, and in Rwanda it was no different. So in this case, the UN was notified the genocide was going to happen and did not do anything to stop the violence. And in fact, even more so, they had soldiers on the ground because of the civil war. So I mentioned there was a civil war between Hutu and Tutsi that started in 1990, and there were peace accords in 1993. So there were peacekeepers on the ground in Rwanda when the genocide was happening. And there's a lot of really depressing footage of these peacekeepers helping white Western folks flee the country, but not doing anything to help Rwandans. So there is a remarkable amount of first understanding of how this happened. A lot of Rwandans will talk about the UN as a bureaucracy that was sort of too stuck to do anything. And if you'll visit the museums, often you will see essentially shade thrown at the United Nations for not intervening. There'll often be a panel dedicated to the fact that the UN had soldiers on the ground, had peacekeepers on the ground. When there's a peacekeeper, the mandate is to keep the peace. So they actually, by UN mandate, cannot go in and prevent violence unless it's for self-defense, but they're actually meant to keep peace. In this case, there was no peace to keep, so they were in a particularly tricky position. For how this has actually impacted Rwanda, there is a popular saying in Rwanda for Rwandan solutions for Rwandan problems. So a lot of folks will tell you that, you know, Rwanda had the genocide, they felt abandoned, so they decided to respond to the genocide their own way. And this was with GACACA, this was with other programs. So it's often tied, as people talk about feeling abandoned by the United Nations, tied to pride in the Rwandan response. Because they were abandoned, of course, the genocide happened, but pride in how the country has rebuilt afterwards. Excellent question. Thank you so much.
Next question. How much does culture and tradition contribute to the warm receptions that the released prisoners are receiving? Could this reception be possible in a Western tradition?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Danielle. And it's something with an in-depth case study, it's hard because I'm really only focusing on Rwanda. So sometimes it can be hard to think what is Rwanda specific, what isn't. And this global working group at the end that I mentioned has been really instrumental for helping me think through what is specific to Rwanda. In terms of culture, I've thought a lot about this question, and I think even more so than culture, there are two things that are specific to Rwanda that are facilitating this. The first is GACACA. And this was this court system that I mentioned. And regardless of what you think about people going to prison, about people standing in a trial in the first place, most of the survivors I have interviewed have said that the people that are coming back, they accept in part because they stood up in front of their community and they apologized. They said, I am so sorry for what I did. This is what I did during the genocide. They had their day in court. They spent time in prison. For them, it's actually not even so important that they spent time in prison, so much so that they apologized publicly in front of the community. So I have heard from many survivors that this public apology moment in GACACA was really important. If it was sincere, if they thought that they were doing it just to get a lighter sentence, as confessions were tied to lighter sentences, then folks clearly were not as impressed by the apology. But if they felt it was a sincere apology, that was important. And that is somewhat cultural because GACACA existed in Rwanda before the genocide. There were local court systems like GACACA, and then they sort of reinvented it to respond to the genocide and adjusted it somewhat. So in that sense, it's cultural. The other thing that I think is important here is time. So time has passed since this violence. And of course, you could think of many instances where much more time has passed and the wounds are still very fresh. But for many people, they still feel these wounds every day. They still miss their family members every day. But it has been 26 years since the genocide. So time has passed. And that does seem to have mattered. I've talked with people in other countries where the violence just occurred a year ago, and then people are coming back and they're having a lot of issues. So I do think that the amount of time since the violent act is important, and that's not so much cultural, but just the context of Rwanda. So those would be two factors that I think matter. I do think it would be possible in Western societies. I think that we have a lot to learn, from the context of Rwanda. And as I've mentioned sort of offhandedly, I don't think things are perfect. So I think there are issues with the state narrative. I think GACACA had its host of issues, but at the end of the day, I think there's a lot we can learn from a situation like this. And I do think it would be possible, but frankly, even in the US, I don't think we often have very structural narratives of individual action for people who engage in crime, for really anything. We often tend to go straight to these individualistic narratives and sort of forget the structural narratives. So I think we could certainly learn from that, and something like that could be possible.
Thank you. The next question, the questioner is thinking strongly about the American post-Civil War and how Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home, and the South was basically able to return to normalcy. Yet the lives of newly freed slaves were impacted heavily, and the impacts have continued generationally in the South. Would it have helped to send the Confederate soldiers away for a while to be detoxed before allowing them to return home, similar to how it helped the Rwandans?
That is an excellent question. I think so. So it's hard to answer. It's a fantastic question that's sending my brain in all these different ways that you can probably tell. But I do think that some time away was important. I don't think it necessarily has to be in prisons. I think there's a lot of different ideas about that. But I don't think it necessarily has to be away in this context or in any context. But with the time away, I think the importance is really how people are prepared to come back. So I think the time away, I think, as you put it, detox, an interesting way to put it, was important, but I think equally important was how people were prepared. And I'm really glad you asked that, because one thing I did not mention, as we can only say so much in a 40-minute talk, is that both Rwandans who are coming back home and communities were prepared in many instances for people's returns. So before people were leaving prison, they went through programs to prepare them to go home, what it would be like to go home, some of the problems they might anticipate participate among reentry, how the country had changed, because Rwanda has changed tremendously since 1994, you know, from going from dirt roads to paved roads to the internet to completely different buildings. So how is this going to change their life today? So they went through programs. And by the same token, some communities, not all communities, but I'm finding that the communities that actually focused on preparation as well are those that are seeing much better experiences. So in some instances, communities came together at local meetings, which are really common in Rwanda, and discussed the fact that people would be coming home from prison, and discussed what it would be like to have them in the community, and talked about their fears for people coming back and how they might be able to mitigate that and how they might welcome them. And again, this was not a universal policy. This was sort of community specific, but those communities are interestingly the ones that are seeing this process work well. So I think this time away mattered, and I really appreciate your question. I think it mattered, and in the context of the Civil War, some type of preparation for return. Of course, your point is very well taken that individuals who were newly freed in the context that you mentioned, or in Rwanda, survivors are still experiencing hurt and harm from seeing these people back. And I don't want to minimize that. So while people are being welcomed, while things are going relatively well, while people are living together once again, it certainly still is hard for survivors of the violence. And many people, you know, one person told me, you know, I thought 20 years was a long sentence until I saw them back in the community. And I thought, oh my gosh, how has it been 20 years already? And they were talking about someone who killed 3 of their children. And, you know, that's a deeply wounding act, and that's something that they still struggle with every day. So many people are willing to re-engage with these individuals, but it doesn't mean that it's not harmful for them. And attention to psychosocial well-being of everyone involved, but certainly of survivors or people who are deeply touched by these actions, is really important. So I also appreciate your question, because it brings up that to the table as well.
Thank you. Next question. What was the context in which this holistic narrative of the genocide was created, particularly amongst those in power, and the government decision to promote it?
It's a great question. So this holistic narrative, it's really interesting. Thank you so much for that question, I believe, Ruth. So I don't believe it was the government's intention to aid reentry and reintegration. I mean, that would be great foresight, but I don't think it was. The government did have an intention to shape the narrative of the violence. And if you think about it, every government does. So every government wants to tell their history. Every government has a hand in telling their history. And in the case of Rwanda, the government is comprised of individuals who stopped the genocide. The current president is actually one of the 2 former leaders of the army that stopped the genocide, which I didn't get into, but it was stopped by a rebel army that had been at war with the former government. So there is a lot invested in this narrative of telling the story of the genocide, and a lot of people in political power benefit from being those who did stop the genocide. In this case, I think a lot of their actions, and I have spoken with some individuals in power to try to understand sort of the roots of this narrative and of this collective memory, was to pinpoint some of the blame outside of Rwanda. So I think some of their initial intention was to really try to point out that it wasn't just Rwandans' fault, and that a lot of these problems came from colonialism. To be very clear, some of the issues did exist before colonialism. So even though I too start the story with colonialism, there were certainly issues, as in any country, beforehand as well. But I do believe that some of the initial impetus behind the narrative wasn't to aid reentry and reintegration, but rather was to show that the genocide wasn't just Rwanda's fault, but should be tied to colonialism, should be tied to some of these interventions, which I don't dispute. Colonialism certainly wreaked havoc in Rwanda. Nonetheless, this narrative has had this really interesting byproduct of aiding reentry and reintegration. So even though I don't think it was the intention, well, I'm sure since I've asked, it really is in many ways, I think at least, aiding these experiences. So it is very, very interesting.
Next question. Thank you so much, Hollie, for your presentation and brilliant insights. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit about the memorialization process affects the reintegration process. Does the way a society is remembering genocide or mass violation of human rights affect the reintegration process of perpetrators, if you have looked into this variable?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adis, for that fantastic question. Absolutely. So in Rwanda, there is a lot invested in remembering the genocide. And this makes some sense. When a country has gone through something horrific, you have to come to terms with it. And I say this as an American that thinks the US has not come to terms with a lot of the issues ranging from slavery to Jim Crow to the genocide of Native peoples. Like there have been a lot of horrific things in the US that I don't think the US has adequately come to terms with. So I think there is something to be said about a country that does look at its past and that says this happened, we have to talk about it, we have to remember it, we have to move forward too. So in Rwanda, there are many efforts to commemorate the violence and memorialize what happened. There is a main memorial in the capital city. There are 8 other government-run memorials, and then there are hundreds of memorials that are run by civilians. And many of these memorials actually tell a story of the genocide, very similar to this sort of state level structural narrative I was telling you, which makes sense, especially for those that are run by the state, that they are also telling a story of the genocide. So I think the memorials are actually one way that this narrative is reaching people, especially folks who never went to school, who will still tell you about Belgian colonialism and German colonialism. I think they're getting it from these memorials and the commemorations that are taking place at the memorials. And in fact, I've asked some of the folks who I've interviewed how they've learned about why the genocide happened, especially those who were beyond school age. So I think the memorials are incredibly important. One thing to note about memorials that isn't so much important for this project, but is still important to note, is that it's still a certain representation of history. So memorials and museums, they paint the picture in a certain way. And because of that, certain narratives are left out. I have a friend, Nikki Fox, who has a forthcoming book on the memorials in Rwanda, in fact, and we've done some other work in Rwanda studying people who rescue, those who stand up and say, no, I will not commit genocide. Sort of my happy project is a project with her. And she has this brilliant book coming forward where she looks at something she calls stratified collective memory. And she argues that in any memorialization, certain narratives are privileged and other narratives are left out. So anytime we think about that, we have to think, you know, this is an important story, and with any story, something's going to be privileged, but whose experiences are being left out and how is that impacting things? So it's a long-winded answer to your question, Adis. Thank you so much for asking. But yes, absolutely. I think in a short answer, the fact that Rwanda had memorialization, has come to terms with the violence, isn't just trying to sweep it under the rug, is incredibly important.
Next question. More or less, most received restorative justice since they admitted their wrongdoings, correct?
Yeah, that is a great question, Kayla. Goodness, it's a great question because it's a hard question. So essentially, yes. So through GACACA, what happened is if someone was willing to come to the table and to admit what they did, often they would have some way to lessen their sentence, which in Rwanda was tied to restorative justice. So if someone wouldn't admit to their crimes, often they would have the longest sentences. If folks would admit to their crimes and would give information and provide a cathartic experience for individuals there, they would typically have their sentence lightened, or they would have the opportunity to go to community service camp. So I didn't mention this, but community service was actually seen as much more of a restorative justice model by many of the Rwandans. Folks in prison are not allowed to go home. They're just within the prison walls. Folks in community service camp get to go home and visit their families every year. They engage with communities. So there are often like soccer matches between the folks in community service camps and the local communities. As you can probably imagine, those individuals are doing much better as they're coming back because of this engagement with the community. But that for many Rwandans was seen as the more restorative justice aspect of GACACA, which would be contrasted with retributive justice, broadly justice that would be sort of seeking to punish individuals, but not really forward-looking in any way. And that retributive justice would be the sort of the longer sentences. There are some life sentences, 5% of cases did end in life sentences, and these folks will never go back to their communities. They are in prison for life, in a few cases, solitary confinement for life. So in terms of broader theories of retributive and restorative justice, absolutely. If someone was willing to confess and talk about what they did and actually express remorse, it was seen as much more restorative, with the small caveat that this probably did then influence some folks to confess wrongly. There are some people in my study who say they never committed violence, that they confessed just to get a lighter sentence. I think some of them are not telling me the truth. I think others actually are telling me the truth, as in every society, some folks are wrongfully convicted. And I do think there was a byproduct where some folks did confess because they thought they would have a lighter sentence, and then were sent to prison or community service camp. But broadly, yes, as we're thinking about restorative justice, as folks are confessing, there were many ways for restorative justice to be enacted.
Next question. Thank you, Dr. Nyseth Brehm, for a fascinating talk. I am curious to know if you have any data about the experiences and impressions of children who were separated from their parents when they served their sentences. How are they handling the reintegration process?
That is such an excellent question, Sarah. Thank you so much for that question. So I have data inadvertently. So I think I mentioned at the second wave. So the first time I talked with people was, 6 months when they came home, or 6 months after they came home. And at that point in time, I also had a research assistant who interviewed their spouse. I was really curious, how does this impact families? In the US, we know that when people are in prison, there are many ripple effects on their families, on their spouses, on their children, and that this can have wide-ranging impacts. And this was a wide-ranging situation in which hundreds of thousands of people were put in prison. So we know that this can be pretty detrimental for people's lives. And I wanted to know, how is this impacting the family? Unfortunately, I did not get to interview their children themselves, although they were often at the homes. On many Rwandan families, many folks are still around, many adult children live nearby, sort of in the same area. So I did get to talk with many of them, not in the interview process, but sort of one-on-one, more informally. And it certainly impacts the children in particular. And what I've seen from what they've shared with me, both the people who were in prison, both their spouses, and the conversations with children, most of the impacts were felt much more immediate to the genocide. So in many instances, people would tell me that after GACACA, when their parent went to prison, or a spouse would tell me when the parent went to prison, the children were often sort of made fun of in the community. So one of the youth militias was called Interahamwe, and for many people, they would be called the children of Interahamwe, and this would be sort of a slur for the children, and something that they would have to come to terms with. So more initially, many of the children were impacted, but from the conversations, it seemed that the impacts lessened. Of course, many of these families were deeply impacted by these folks just being away for so long. So in many instances, the spouses would talk about how they would have to keep a household running and take care of the children, how the children did have a role model. It's really tricky, because when we think about mass violence, often when we talk about these situations, we talk about prison as if it can be a very good thing, but we also know in the US context and around the world that incarceration has a lot of horrific consequences for peoples and for families. So we're often trying to strike this balance of people, being held accountable and what that should look like, but still understanding that prison can often just deepen inequalities and exacerbate issues. And in many cases, a lot of these families, weren't able to visit their parent in prison, often because of lack of money for transportation. So often, because they were missing a parent, they did not have a lot of money in their family because they only had one parent working. So they were barely getting by with enough to eat and didn't have enough money to go for transport to the prison to visit their parent. So in many instances, they had sort of estranged relationships, and many families have sort of had to work at coming back together again after being apart for 20 or 25 years. Even though they are initially being welcomed by their families, they're still having to work to become a family again, and for the kids as well. I know this is a long answer, but I'll also note that I did ask everyone, did they tell their kids what they did? How did they talk about it with their kids? And some have or at least they've told me, they've had very in-depth conversations. Others didn't. Either way, their kids were often at their GACACA court trials, so they heard what they did. So often, even between the person who was in prison and the children, they've had to sort of negotiate and talk through what happened, what their parent did, try to understand, and try to move forward together. So that's that's sort of a long, convoluted way of saying I didn't interview children one-on-one, but have gotten a lot of different data on their experiences from the parents and from one-on-one conversations, not actually official interviews. But absolutely, having a parent in prison certainly impacted them and continues to impact them in many ways. Thank you, Sarah, for that excellent question.
Next, thank you for your very insightful presentation. Thinking about the current situation in the US with the tensions of the political polarization, are there insights that can be applied here? I'm thinking mostly about various militia and violence that occurs around various protests.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, for that excellent question. Yeah, you know, I hadn't thought about the militias tied to protests or some of the militias with goodness, their plans to kidnap governors or whatnot. There's a lot going on in the US right now that is certainly very scary, to say the least. And as strange as it might sound now to extrapolate this, I will say first trying to understand the structural factors that impact people to engage in these militias. And this can be hard, right? This takes a lot. So this is, in some ways, your brilliant question is asking us to put ourselves in the shoes of Rwandans who are accepting people back, who saw people do horrific things, and then to think, okay, I understand why someone could do this. It is not okay. They certainly, need to be blamed for what they did. It's not taking the blame off their shoulders, but it's still trying to say, I can understand how this could happen. I can understand the structural factors that might impact someone to make decisions that would lead them to genocide. In much the same way, an initial answer, even though it certainly isn't enough, would be having a more structural understanding of why individuals might be willing to engage in militias in the first place, even in the US context, what structural factors of economic inequality, for instance, might be impacting some of these decisions. And again, this isn't meant to excuse in any way what's happening, but more trying to think more structurally about what's happening and thinking in terms of the solutions. Solutions that are individual based aren't going to do it. We need wide-scale systematic change in the US, just as wide-scale systematic change is needed to address systematic and structural problems. So I think the initial thought I have to your question, which I'll think a lot more about because I think it's fantastic, is to think more structurally and to recognize structural factors that impact actions, and then to think about these structures as we think about solutions. More broadly for the US, I think, and I referenced this before, and I think in reference to Adis's question, we have a lot of issues in our own history that have not been dealt with, that we haven't come to terms with. I think for those of you who are familiar with Bryan Stevenson's brilliant work, and if you're not, I hope you all go look up the Equal Justice Initiative and some of their amazing work. They have that lynching memorial, for instance, where they create a memorial and they challenge communities where lynching occurred to actually put up a memorial to say a lynching occurred here. We have to come to terms with this. We can't just pretend this didn't happen. So I think more broadly, in linking in with Adis's question about memorialization and having a narrative about what happened, we have a lot of history in the US that Americans haven't come to terms with, and that hasn't been called what it is, and that isn't appropriately taught in textbooks. So people do not grow up learning about what happened. We're still, I live in a town most of the time called Columbus that honors Christopher Columbus, who we know was, committed genocide. So we still have a lot of issues in the US to come to terms with. And I think coming to terms with them, having memorials, thinking about structure, all can be lessons to take away. And I think your question I'll be thinking more about as well. So thank you so much for that.
So I think we have time there are 3 more questions, and let's see if we can get through those. So those will be the last questions. So the next one is, in the book Killing Neighbors, one older Rwandan was quoted as one saying, "A Tutsi with no cows is a Hutu." Has that type of belief or sentiment changed in the rural areas of the country, for example, far away from Kigali, the capital city, in the aftermath of the 1994 genocide?
Another excellent question. So this is linking in a couple of Rwanda-specific things. I had mentioned that Hutu and Tutsi before the genocide were racialized via colonialism, and that they were actually social classes. So Tutsi tended to have cattle, and some even said that you had to have about 10 cattle to be Tutsi, and Hutu did not. So this quote is sort of linking to that in particular and talking about socioeconomic status. One thing I will note on that, and this brings up an interesting point, which is a half answer, is that ideas around Hutu and Tutsi actually don't exist in Rwanda today, or they're not supposed to exist. And what I mean by that is after the genocide, the government said, we do not have Hutu, we do not have Tutsi, we are all Rwandan. So they essentially did away with ethnic identities. They're not included in the census. It's actually seen as genocidal ideology in some ways to refer to them in certain ways. So people were previously considered Tutsi, but today they would be considered a Rwandan, or they were previously considered Hutu, but today are Rwandan. And it would be considered rude. I have to tell my students when we go for the study abroad, they can't ask someone, are you a Hutu, are you a Tutsi? This is seen as rude because these identities don't exist anymore. In reality, they do still exist is somewhat. So it's very hard to take away an identity, say this doesn't exist, and then have people just go along with that, if that makes sense. So people are still coming to terms with what it means to not have these identities. And in some ways, identities tied to the violence have taken over ethnic identities. So you know if someone was a survivor, they were a Tutsi. Whereas if their family was in prison, they were most likely a Hutu. So ethnic identities still exist. And I know I'm not completely getting at your fascinating question only because there are a couple of others, but it reminded me I didn't mention that. And that's a very interesting and important aspect of what's going on in Rwanda is that officially there are no longer ethnic identities. So someone would not even say Hutu or Tutsi when they're talking with you today, unless you're talking about the genocide. But today it would even be considered rude to invoke that. Excellent question.
Next question. When you entered into this particular subject, did you have any prior thoughts, opinions, bias that have changed since meeting with those who had been convicted, and or survived the genocide?
Thank you, Kayla. That's a great question. You know, I think every social scientist has bias when they go into a field, and I think it's important to come to terms with that bias. I think I had many. I will say one of them, you know, in genocide studies, we often talk about the banality of evil, which is this idea that people who engage in violence are normal people. So it's sort of a hallmark of genocide studies. And I had learned about that and sort of been like, yes, that I believe that's true. But I think I mentioned my partner is a survivor. I did not know what to expect when I was going to the prisons. I was a little nervous, frankly, to sit with people. And I was overall very pleasantly surprised. We would have these great conversations about the weather, about my experience in Rwanda, about the food, and then sort of move into what happened into the genocide. And they would tell me about how they killed someone. And it was a very strange experience to have this like great conversation and feel like I was connecting with someone and then move into them telling me this horrific story. And that's more to say my bias was that I think I hadn't even fully understood that idea of the banality of evil until I interviewed people and until I spoke with them and until we had these delightful conversations, and especially going back to visit their families, I feel like I know them, which was very interesting for me as someone who had studied it from afar and learned about this idea that people who engage in violence are in many ways normal, even though the term normal can be tricky. But it was really talking with them up close that I really came to understand that. So that would be one bias, but I really appreciate your question because I think it's important for everyone to think about all of the biases we bring with us as we conduct research.
Does the community continue rehabilitation efforts and programs for the people who return from their sentences? If so, are there long-term commitments generations later to keep up these activities?
Mona, this is a wonderful question. Sort of. and this is something we're having a lot of conversations about. So every research project in Rwanda has to be sponsored by a Rwandan organization. And this is meant to prevent people coming in, doing research, sort of benefiting on research for their own scholarly career, but not actually benefiting Rwanda. So I have a research sponsor called the Institute for Research and Dialogue on Peace, which is a local nonprofit. And your question is very important because the short answer is, in some communities, there are continued programs. In many, there are not. And there really is no continued promise to continue them going forward. So one of the things my research sponsor, IRDP, and I have been talking about are working with a number of Rwandan organizations to write grants and to actually create programs like you suggest. So your question is brilliant because they are needed. This process doesn't just end. I think, you know, my third or fourth slide kind of spanning the literature of criminology mentioned that reentry and reintegration is a very dynamic process. It's certainly something that's going to continue. People are going to continue coming home, and also people are going to continue reintegrating into communities. This doesn't happen overnight. So this does need to be a long scale process and a lot of attention paid to what this is going to look like. So absolutely, there isn't a broad commitment, but the hope is through this project, working with Rwandan partners who will take the lead on the ground, there will be some type of programming that can actually sort of recognize that this is a process and that there needs to be programs and commitments, as you so eloquently put. Thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting presentation with evidence-based developments in treating trauma and PTSD, such as PTSD. Which approaches were used in Rwanda?
That is such a great question, Marian. Depressingly, there wasn't a lot of attention paid to psychosocial well-being for quite a while in Rwanda. And in part, I think lack of infrastructure, part an emphasis on basic needs. So after the genocide, with millions of people displaced inside the country, millions displaced outside the country, and then hundreds of thousands, sent to prison, almost all families were impacted. A lot of houses were destroyed. A lot of people didn't have food. So there was sort of this triage idea. Many of the people that I've spoken with said that there was an effort on basic needs, and their understanding of basic needs did not include psychosocial well-being. So it actually wasn't until much more recently that there have been some different counseling programs put in place. There's a great program called the Vega that works specifically with survivors, but will work with people who are not survivors as well. And there have been a couple of other nonprofits that have popped up now to really try to pay attention to lasting consequences for psychosocial well-being. For the people in the prison, while they are in the prison or community service camp, they do have access to counseling. I didn't mention this, but I administer a civilian PTSD scale in all interviews, and essentially everyone would have it. And it makes sense for those who engage in violence or for those who see violence. They saw horrific violence for 3 months or engage in it themselves, and they have a lot of lasting consequences from this. So in the prisons and community service camps, there are programs. They are not available for people once they leave. There is a paucity of funds, and a lot of folks in Rwanda still will say that the funds should go for survivors, not for the folks who committed violence. So there are still certainly a lot of issues as you're hearing me talk, but this is a broad way of saying there's some attention to it now, but there definitely is not enough, even though a lot of nonprofits are starting to, and not to mention intergenerational transmission of trauma as well. So we know that children are going to get trauma from their parents, and that this is passed on through stories, through biologically, and there is starting to be growing attention to this, but still not enough. And often it comes down to a lack of funds to actually implement programs countrywide that would be sorely needed. It's an excellent question.
Last question. What are some tactics that Tutsis employed to resist the genocide, such as Jewish resistance during the Holocaust?
Such a fantastic question, and really a nice way to end. So there are great stories of resistance from Tutsi and from Hutu, actually. So from Tutsi, unfortunately, there are fewer stories of resistance from Tutsi. The stories of resistance would often be the people who banded together to try to fight the militias, and could often last for a few days, and then typically did not last much beyond that, as depressing as that might sound. So there's a memorial in Western Rwanda called Bisesero, and it sort of commemorates the fact that a group of Tutsi came together on top of a hill and tried their hardest to fight off the killing groups for as long as they could, and tried to protect as many people as possible. And the memorial is set up in like a zigzag format to sort of symbolize the back and forth between this group of people trying to resist and between the killing groups that eventually were successful. So there are not many stories of people successfully resisting, of Tutsis successfully resisting. But I'll take your question, which is excellent, to also briefly mention the Hutu who resisted, because I think it is an uplifting way to end a conversation about genocide. In every genocide, as I mentioned, so we have hundreds of thousands of people who participated. They participated in large part because they were encouraged to do so by this interim government. But some people said, no, I will not participate. I refuse. It is wrong for a variety of reasons. And they actually risk their lives to save others, much like the righteous among the nations from the Holocaust. You had hundreds, actually probably thousands of Rwandans who risked their lives to save others. And I mentioned I have a different project with my colleague, Nikki Fox, where we've been interviewing these people to try to understand what made them do what they did. Why did they decide to resist the genocidal violence? And there are so many beautiful stories of people who knew that if they were caught, if they were found to be resisting the genocide, they could be killed. Their whole family could be killed, but they still decided to help people. Sometimes they helped people they knew. Other times they helped people they didn't know, but they were just another human in need. And they would sometimes hide them in their homes. Rwandan homes wouldn't have an attic or a basement, so usually it would be under a bed, or sometimes they would dig a hole and hide them in banana plantations. There are stories, there were checkpoints, sort of where people would be, we checked as they were passing if they were Hutu or Tutsi, and they would actually check the ID cards that were created by the Belgians. And there were all these stories of people helping people pass checkpoints. One woman rescuer told us she stuffed a pillow under her dress to pretend she was pregnant and had two Tutsi with her, and she pretended they were her sons helping her get to the hospital and that she was pregnant and they needed to go past as soon as possible. So there are all of these remarkable creative stories of resilience in times of such trauma and hardship, and amazing stories of people trying to stand up and say, no, we're going to resist this violence. We will not. And the last thing I'll say on that is one of the hallmarks of this research is that, you know, these folks aren't remarkable. They're doing remarkable things, don't get me wrong, but anyone can stand up and resist injustice when they see it. And it's really important to do that. And the folks who did resist it, you know, often were not educated individuals. They didn't feel like they had done anything remarkable in their lives. They just said, you know, this is wrong and we have to do something about it. And I'm not just going to watch this happen. And I think that's an important lesson for everyone to remember as injustice unfolds around us in the US and elsewhere every day, that people can stand up and do something, and that's important. So thank you so much for that excellent question.
What a great place to bring this wonderful session to an end. I can't thank you enough, Dr. Nyseth, for doing this beautiful presentation. Very illuminating, very thoughtful and informative. You really have given us much to think about and to consider as we strive to really understand better human nature, which you have touched upon so much during this talk. And of course, the whole role of governance and government and NGOs and institutions such as the UN and the possibilities of peace. And we look to apply the lessons you have taught us today in how to honorably coexist with one another, starting in our own communities. I have a feeling we're going to have you back in the near future to then have you speak about the other research that you're conducting. So again, my thanks to you, and we appreciate having you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. I wanted to just end by reminding our audience of our next event, which is scheduled for November 24. It is going to occur at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it features Dr. Joseph Richardson Jr., who is the existing chair of the Department of African American Studies at the University of Maryland. The title of his talk, Life After the Gunshot, a digital storytelling project on the impact of structural and impersonal violence and the healing process for young Black men. We invite you to go to our website to check for future events and to follow us on social media. And again, I want to thank Dr. Nyseth Brehm for this wonderful presentation, and we look forward to seeing the rest of you hopefully at our next event. Take care. Bye-bye.